Hello all and welcome to the RAF Museum's lecture series. This is our kind of second lecture of the year and we're really excited for this one. It should be really good. So Mark Wilkins today will be exploring the legacies of aerial combat, illustrating the ways in which pilots had to amalgamate their suffering and experiences into their lives following the First World War. And this is obviously live streamed. So just a little bit about Mark Wilkins, our talker today. He is a historian, writer, and museum professional. He is the current curator of the maritime history at Calvert Marine Museum. He has been director and curator of both the Cape Cod Maritime Museum and the Atwood House Museum, Chatham House Historical Society, and has worked for the Smithsonian and Mystic Seaport. Mr. Wilkins is a published author of books and articles relating to maritime and aviation history. Mark has a master's degree in history from Harvard University and has written several books relating to First World War aviation, including Spad Fighters, Fokker DR-1, Germany's famed triplane in World War I, Aero-Neurosis, German fighter aircraft of World War I, Design, Construction and Innovation, British fighter aircraft of World War I, Design, Construction and Innovation, and is currently working on a third volume in this series of French aircraft. He is adjunct faculty, history department at St. Mary's College, Maryland. Mark served as a historical consultant and as a producer of aerial effects for the Lafayette Escadrille documentary film. He serves on the board of the Patuxent River Naval Aviation Museum. So I'll talk about this just at the end, but we have a Q&A section at the end. But just before that, I'll be letting you know about a current call to action the RAF Museum has put out, looking for donations to help us save the Arthur Scarfe Victoria Cross Medal. So pay attention to that. But if you click at the call to action button at the bottom, that'll let you get a jump on what I'll be telling you later. So without further ado, I'll be welcoming Mark Wilkins onto the screen. Hello, Mark, and take it away.
Thank you, Sam. I'm very pleased to be giving this talk today through the RAF Museum. Thank you again for inviting me. This is a subject near and dear to my heart. Most historical subjects that I research and I'm interested in, the chief interest in those subjects is basically the psychology or the psychological factors that undergird decisions and events and cause and effect with regards to these events. This particular subject, I have a sort of a dual interest in maritime and aviation history. And this particular subject was sort of an outgrowth of an article I wrote for the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum called Dark Side of Glory, which explored basically the origins of what we now term PTSD in flyers. And at the end of the article, I found I had so much material that there was enough for a book. And that's what basically aero-neurosis became. So without too much delay, I'll see if I can load this up and get going here. Yeah, so I'll give you an overview of kind of what we're going to cover today. Context, as you know, as an historian or a student of history is so important with regards to a specific event or causation. So the various factors that sort of coalesced at the Western Front during the First World War resulted in various inventions, such as the submarines, aircraft, the machine gun, as well as various socioeconomic factors, such as urbanization, neurasthenia, which I'll tell you a little bit about, and the rise of military aviation, which began almost with the first flight by the Wright brothers. They were quickly, getting ahead of myself, as I often do. Anyway, this resulted in full-blown mechanized warfare, which coalesced on the Western Front in 1914. It caught everybody by surprise. Each of these little areas sort of developed independently in sort of a bubble, and all found themselves sort of mixed together on the front. And the average human psyche, the people that fought the war, were in quite a shock. So aero-neurosis is it's an okay title. That wasn't my first choice for the book, but it's more to do with that sort of shock to the psyche that was experienced at the Western Front and specifically in the air. Okay, so urbanization, yeah. So what was once rural and agrarian largely, this happened globally. Slowly, people gravitated towards the cities for jobs. The rise of industrialization. Hours were long, and wages were small. This is pre-union. In the United States, unions didn't really get going until the First World War. Assembly lines replaced sort of artisanal goods, and a dazzling array of new technology and ideas. I mean, this is all happening at the same time. The airplane, the car, the telegraph, Einstein's theory of special relativity, production line techniques in various factories. It's all happening, heading out of the Gilded Age, or the Belle Epoque if you're in France, moving into the early 20th century, all right? Yeah, so neurasthenia was a condition described by Mr. Beard here in his book. He blamed, it was basically mourning the loss of quiet agrarian life. He blamed steam power, the periodical press, the telegraph, the sciences, and the mental activity of women. Go figure. He was sort of this bittersweet reminiscence of how things used to be, somewhat nostalgic, and again, this rise to industrialization and urbanization, he found quite alarming. Okay, we can't really talk about World War I without talking about Hiram Maxim, the inventor of the machine gun. Interesting man. He also dabbled in aircraft designs, invention. Wasn't very successful at it, but he was a consummate inventor, dabbling in everything. Well, dabbling in many patents: coffee roasting, electric light bulbs, airplanes, and what he called the killing machine, which was his Maxim gun, which was bought up by every country. Every country had these, except for, I believe, the Turks and the Chinese. They didn't want anything to do with this thing. Actually, I think it was the Chinese who said, "Well, you have no decent vice. If you come back with a new vice for us, we'll listen to you. But we don't want your machine gun." Maxim had somewhat of a guilty conscience. At the end of his life, he developed this thing called the pipe of peace, which was a cure for bronchitis. It was used tree resin as an inhaler, and his closing tract in his memoirs talks about, well, I guess I'll have to be remembered for my pipe of peace, which seems kind of silly, but that'll be my legacy. He was trying to sort of blot out the fact that his machine gun was responsible for millions of deaths during the First World War. Interestingly, he believed his gun would only be used on what he termed savages. Okay, he never envisaged that it would be used on populations of Europe, for example. So that was kind of a construct that he developed to rationalize the construction of this thing. Okay. Fritz Haber, okay, inventor of chlorine gas. In peacetime, he actually won a Nobel Prize, synthesis of ammonia for fertilizer and explosives. The militarized version of this was a perversion of the original, and his mantra was, "In peace for mankind, in war for the fatherland." So he had no problem about developing this gas to help break the stalemate, the Western Front. Okay, these were later, as we know, outlawed by the Geneva Convention after the Second World War. I think actually his research resulted in Zyklon B, which, as you students of the Holocaust will remember what that was all about. Also, the submarines. This was an invention that was cropping up in all countries. Germany was the first to really use it to effect. Of course, you'll witness the Lusitania disaster in 1915. And Britain viewed these, Lord Nelson termed them as burglarious sneak dodges down below. He thought that was not a gentleman's type of weapon, that it shouldn't be used in naval engagements. It was not civilized, okay? Anyway, these were being developed, as I said, in kind of a bubble. Of course, Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. The idea of this crazed Captain Nemo and his submarine didn't help the image of the submarine none too little. So, and as I mentioned, military aviation with the first Wright brothers flight, and then Blériot's historic Channel crossing in 1909. England was actually very alarmed by this, because they basically, Lord Northcliffe and Minister of War Haldane were very outspoken in their desire for an air service in England. based on especially the Blériot flight, because they felt like England's Navy couldn't protect it any longer because these airplanes, cheap to build and could fly over the channel, were a real threat. And as we found out in World War I, the Zeppelin raids over London were quite devastating, even if the bombing raids weren't. Okay. So yeah, this, as I mentioned, this coalescing of all of these inventions at the front, full-blown mechanized warfare. Many of the tracks of the day, people that were there that fought, described the enemy as being faceless, right? I mean, even if you were in a trench, you could see somebody. They might have a gas mask on, or they were behind the entrenchments, so you couldn't really see anything. Tanks, planes, epic artillery. First World War is certainly all about large caliber munitions, for sure, on the ground. Gas, machine guns, subs and Zeppelins. Yeah, these were, think about it. We're used to this nowadays with, my goodness, we've been to space and back, and the jet aircraft, the stealth aircraft we have today, we sort of have become numb to the amount of technology that look at us now. I'm talking to England from America on my computer in my office. So we take this for granted. Back then, this was all very new stuff, right? This was a shock. It was like you wouldn't see most of this stuff in the small little town, and we'll get to that. Most of my case studies were from small rural communities, and you wouldn't see this stuff in your daily life. This was quite the shock, okay? Yeah, so then this notion of the immortal ace was also crafted during World War I. I threw this in here because I don't know why I threw this in here, but this was something that the press, especially in France and Germany, really promoted to sort of boost morale at home, that there was, in fact, something that wasn't horrible and disgusting in terms of the epic deaths due to artillery about the war. This sort of very heraldic, chivalric, these knights of the air, it was romanticized. Now, the pilots were very aware of this mythology and were much more realistic about their role. And actually, as the war progressed, I think Eddie Rickenbacker referred to dogfighting as scientific murder. And by that time, it had become so codified. Early on, it was much more one-on-one. There weren't group tactics involved. Pilots knew that they were far from invincible, even though they tried to make them out that way in the press, especially like Bulka, Richthofen, Albert Ball, McManus. A lot of the aces, Georges Guillemet, were made out to be immortal. Of course, many of them fell in battle. So, aviation psychiatry, a very new field. Aero-neurosis, basically, by definition, meant any nervous condition brought on by flying. Early treatments and definitions designed to get pilots and troops back to fighting as soon as possible. This was the thing with both shell shock and these aviation psychiatry diagnoses. If it was structural, like originally shell shock was thought to be a physiological damage to the brain due to the concussive blasts of artillery. But the doctors and the leadership, military leadership, said, well, if we do that, then they're going to be in hospital forever. But if it's a psychological problem, we can actually, with some treatment, get them back into the trenches. Because guess what? We need them because we're losing people faster than we can enlist or conscript people. So that was kind of the thing. And it was often, this happened in the Second World War as well, confused with cowardice. If you were suffering from combat fatigue, which is a better term for it, this was often confused with cowardice and or labeled that way. Of course, William Rivers' psychodynamic model, which was a breakthrough, his studies at Craig Lockhart, favored confrontation rather than repression of fears. And we'll get to that with some of the case studies. That was actually a huge breakthrough in terms of the healing process, not only for flyers, but for troops on the ground and sailors as well. Okay. So E.W. Craig was a RAF psychiatrist and squadron leader, and he listed 18 causes he believed led to nervous breakdown. You can read all of these, and basically these are conditions encountered by every combat pilot in the First World War. So, insomnia, night flying, mental stress, alcohol, tobacco, high altitudes, oxygen want, that was imperfectly, if not not understood at all during the time. So long periods of flying without leave, high and low flying altitudes. So all of these things contributed to nervous breakdown, and all of these pilots experienced, well, certainly these factors, but to varying degrees, different levels of combat fatigue. Okay. This is a great quote by Ted Parsons. He was a flyer in the Lafayette Escadrille. He was an American flyer. No matter whether a man is visibly scarred or not by a shower of flying lead, each time it happens to him, it leaves an invisible scar. He begins flinching before he knows it, and in the end, the strain cuts into his nerves. If he hasn't a sedative for those strained nerves, and sometimes despite it, a bird is likely to go so screwy that it goes wild and begs for danger like dope, or gets the wind up, becomes completely unstuck. So if you unpack this statement, what he's talking about is the structural use of alcohol, okay, to cope with the strain of flying, which he did. He would take a flask, the cold alone, not to mention the stress of flying in these very, I won't call them all of them frail, but in the early war, they were very frail. The aircraft, they became stronger as the war wore on. But all of these different factors, he talks about needing alcohol to kind of deal with the strain. He also talks about the, what we call an adrenaline junkie today, begs for danger like dope. It was an addictive condition, the fighting was. I think it still is. Anyway, this great quote by Parsons, and there's a few others in here. Oh, good. So now we're at the case study. So I studied several pilots from different nations, and they all are interesting in their own way. So how are we doing on time? We're good. Elliot White Springs was an American. He came from a somewhat, I won't say a broken home, but he was shipped off to boarding school at a very early age and was deprived of meaningful relationship with his family, his immediate family, especially his father. Okay, his father would become a source of torment to this man all through his adult life. A very contentious relationship with his dad. He wanted to be a writer. He went to Princeton University. They told him he wasn't a very good writer, but he would have been there at the same time as F. Scott Fitzgerald and some other literary luminaries of the time. He joined in 1914. He wanted to fly. He was caught up in the craze, the flying craze that swept the world, really, in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. So his lack of a decent home life, I feel, increased his bond at the front with his two best buddies, Grider and Callahan. And he definitely experienced a genuine war neurosis, and interestingly helped heal by writing his book Warbirds. It was one of the earliest examples of art therapy. Okay, this notion of writing through what you experienced helped many flyers, and actually many people in general, to heal after the war, and any war for that matter. I've experienced this with pilots I've interviewed that were in the Vietnam conflict, Vietnam War. Same deal. The more they wrote about it, the more they're able to come to terms with what happened, because it happens on a very compressed timeline in combat. All right. So he and his 3 buddies turned themselves the 3 Musketeers. Interestingly, Springs credited Grider with writing Warbirds. He wanted the royalties from that book to go to Grider's family because he was actually very well off. His father was very affluent and had this amazing textile mill in the southern United States, which ultimately Springs would take control of. He was traumatized over losing Grider. He blamed himself. And writing Warbirds allowed him to finish the story, so-called, of their friendship the way he wanted, which is a very interesting point. So, what happens in reality, but this book enabled him to sort of fictionalize and tweak the story to a satisfactory conclusion for himself. And in so doing, helped him really to come to terms with what happened in a positive way. Okay. This is an example. He wrote many letters home because in between patrols, this was all you could do. There was no TV. There were no, iPads or iPhones to surf. This is what you did. You wrote letters. And so you can read through this. He's trying to process what happened to Mac. This is Grider, who was lost. Gone and forgotten. The Hun's aim proves my bus goes back on me. or I pass out from irritation at the doings of the Springs family on the home front. Anyway, I hope my ghost haunts you and never gives you a moment's peace. I could sleep with great ease, but instead I'm writing to you, guilt trip, until time to go up on patrol at 7 and try to avenge Mac. May your powdered nose take on the color of an overripe tomato, and may you never see your feet again except in a mirror. I'm completely fed up with you. So this was his stepmom, Lena, and he had an equally dysfunctional relationship with her. And so all of this dissatisfaction with his home life put more emphasis on what happened at the front, okay, for him. This is a very, very interesting quote by Springs. He's talking about nerve being cultivated or may not include recklessness, to carry through anything, anywhere without faltering. And he talks about a man who rushes a fight and lets his hand shake and the trigger hasn't got it. The fool who doesn't know when to be afraid hasn't got it. But a man with nerve is a hardened, tempered individual who may be scared to death, but fear to him is like water on a duck's back. So he witnessed a lot of people who didn't have nerve and perished. And the people that survived, many of them did have this. And it's a very interesting insight into this cultivation and crafting of a very strong backbone and nerve in combat. And he mentions that, not many had this. It was a very rare thing, but the ones that did were truly to be feared. This is actually a picture of Kiffin Rockwell, another member of the Lafayette Escadrille, who was just a born killer. He had that kind of nerve. That's why I put that picture there. Another great quote from Springs. No matter where I go or what I do, the best part of me will always remain between Zerbruges and Armentières in front of Cambrai. There I lived a long lifetime. There lie my companions and many adversaries. And there also lies the biggest part of myself. And their memory will always be a seer. I love that. Their memory will always be a seer. Such a poignant and powerful statement about his war experience and him talking about it. The fact that he lived a long lifetime there, the distortion in time and stress that happens in combat burns those experiences into somebody's soul, for lack of a better word. So his book Warbirds, I'm sure many of you have read it. It's a fascinating book and well written too. So in spite of what Princeton said, he did all right as a writer. Doctor says I've been behind the 8 ball all my life, and this is the first chance I've had to shake off my nervousness. Doctor predicts great things when I absorb his teaching in mental hygiene. I love that. Mental hygiene. Positive psychology. He told me it was time to quit trying to cure myself and let him cure me. Genuine war neurosis after 1918 apparently cured myself by writing it out, but I didn't have the concrete foundation under me to prevent its return. Yeah, even in spite of writing the book, these nightmares and episodes and memories would come back to haunt him. I mean, how can you forget that? Of course, and my troubles are rooted in 1918 and father, of course, the very dysfunctional and unsatisfying relationship he had with his dad, which was so important to him, was a source of constant frustration and despair. So there he is after the war. Was quite the character. Barnstormed, partied, and caroused for a time. It just went kind of off the rails, went wild. I love his shirt. Where can I get one just like that? He assumed the family business in 1931, Springs Cotton Mills. He used very provocative marketing, a lot of scantily clad women wearing Springs Cotton Mills products. And there's his wonderful shirt that has many of those illustrations on it. He wrote Warbirds. He also served in World War II. And the Spring White house is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. So you can go visit the character's mansion if you're ever down south. So anyway, he got through it okay. As far as many go, he fared all right, better than others. William Lambert, another American born in Arlington, Ohio, was a chemist during the RFC in 1916. Actually, also Springs served in the RFC as well. Sent to 24 Squadron flying SE-5As. 17 victories awarded the DFC. He adopted the British ethos of repression of trauma and maintained a veneer of cheerfulness. We'll see this a lot in the case studies with the RFC and then what became the RAF, there was I don't know if it was stress from leadership level, but it was definitely an unspoken rule that you don't talk about problems in the air, especially in the mess hall with your mates. You kept that, you maintain a cheerful external appearance to your fellow pilots, and don't let the stress of combat erode squadron morale. So there's a lot of good sense to that, but it also kind of was a boomerang effect in terms of a man's psychology. You can see here his statement, admiring birds, and my own mission would not be for food. No, I should be gliding down to kill my fellow man. Already here, he's starting to question what he's doing. He's killing people. So that didn't sit well with him. I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit because I'm conscious of the time. This is an interesting tract where he talks about tweaking his SE5A, working on every little detail to make it as perfect as it could be. The flyers felt the strain of combat flying for sure. One thing they could do, and many things they couldn't control, one thing they could control was with their machine, their aircraft. So many pilots, you see this in all the air forces, spent excessive time tweaking and cleaning and making everything as perfect in their aircraft as they could, because as you know, one little bolt or turnbuckle, rigging screw comes undone in the air, that could spell death or catastrophe. So making sure every little detail was taken care of with his SE was really important to him and many other pilots. Okay. Talks about moving into the later part of the war when some mobility was attained with tanks and strafing or strafing. This became part of their job. He said he wasn't cut out for it. Talking about this strafing, this poor devil tried to pull a piece of sheet metal over his body, didn't like it. Incidents like this sometimes made me want to quit. How I hated this aspect of our work. Guess I was just not made for it. Now, von Richthofen, the Red Baron, had no problem strafing people. He actually enjoyed it. It's another matter. But another quote about this is a picture of Ernst Udet here on the right, very iconic image. But anyway, he's talking about the effects of combat fatigue. No one complained, but one had only to look into the face of a pilot and watch his actions. The story was there. He's talking about that you could see, it was visible on people's faces how much they had hardened during the stress, the crucible of combat. Okay, and again, time spent. I mean, the sort of the addictive nature of combat and the sort of intense excitement of it. Men were okay, more or less, while they were in the air. It's when they were in their quarters at night and had time to reflect that much of the troubles developed. That's what he's talking about. I had no time to think about it, but 24 hours later, it was a different story. Okay. So this particular case, he basically experienced his trauma like a light switch. He's talking about this, almost everything from that day until about October is a blank. Certain incidents I remember dimly, remembers an air raid, watching someone loading his stuff into a tender. Later, I was swimming with another pilot on a long, white, sandy beach. A woman in nurse's uniform strolling along the beach joined us and asked if we'd like to go up to a large building at Wimereux. So, recently converted into a hospital. Later, I was in a London hospital, evidently for the whole of September. So, his psyche just shut down. He just doesn't remember much, blotted out. He was also subject of electroshock treatment, which was a common way to kind of snap people out of their war trauma. Okay, so very different from Springs, who got through the war okay, and then the stress came later. So this happened in real time during the war. War ended before his recovery period was finished. He had 18 victories, so he was no slouch in terms of a combat pilot. After the war, he became a barnstormer back in his hometown, worked as an engineer. Invented this kooky thing. It was a pipe rest for a smoker's chin. It was like a little tripod that sat on your chin that rested your pipe on it. Really kind of nutty. Joined the U.S. Air Force and served in World War II, retired as a lieutenant colonel. He wrote Combat Report in 1973, which is a very good book. If you haven't read that, it chronicles his war experience. Interestingly, he had in his possession a piece of the Red Baron's triplane covering that was shot down. The Red Baron was shot down. So that's William Lambert. Okay. Now, Roy Brown, you'll know, well, you probably know that he actually did not shoot down the Red Baron, but at the time, he was credited with doing that. He came from a small town in Canada, joined the RNAS, trained at Chingford in the UK, and showed signs of anxiety over flying early on, okay? Came from another small town, was involved in athletics. This is kind of a common model for pilots at this time. Parents were moderately successful, so he was comfortable. Carleton Place, Ontario is where he grew up. He went to the Wright School of Flying in Dayton, Ohio, and his letters talk a lot about how disappointed he was with that because the Wrights were not interested in their flying school anymore at that point, so it was not terribly well run. And he talks about always running out of money because he's breaking airplanes, trying to learn how to fly, and his parents are like, okay, well, we'll send you a check, but it might take a while to get there. And he's like, well, I can't fly until I get the money. Anyway, it's kind of comic. So here he's talking about, he's in combat. He's talking about his day off. The day off for me, it's raining in low clouds. Hopes it keeps up for a week. This is kind of weather everyone likes to see. There's not been much excitement the last few days, but I've already had enough to last me the rest of my life. So already at this point, he's had enough of this. And like I said, each person, each pilot has a finite quantity of emotional capital, right? Once it's gone, it's gone. So Raymond Collishaw, British ace, friend of Roy Brown, talks about describing him. The man he found that afternoon was utterly different. Gray hairs in his head, lost 25 pounds. His once sparkling eyes were now bloodshot and sunken. Brown admitted he'd been living for more than a month on a diet of milk and brandy. This was a common kind of treatment for cold, altitude sickness, nerves, upset stomach. Already had a nervous breakdown, suffering from a severe ulcer. Collishaw was shocked and begged his friend not to fly any further missions, but both men knew this was impossible. Yeah, you couldn't just say, I'm done. I had enough fun, I'm going home. You couldn't do that. You'd be branded a coward for desertion of duty. You'd be probably court-martialed. So that was the drill. There wasn't the kind of flight surgeon protocols in place that there are now to deal with this. So, and of course, he's credited with shooting down the Baron. If you read the tract about the actual engagement, it's unclear whether he was the one that shot him down. It seems that way. Anyway, we know now that he was shot down by a machine gunner, Australian machine gunner on the ground. Popkin, I think, was his name, and not Brown. But he took full responsibility for it. And if you read this tract, he's just lamenting over seeing the actual corpse of the Red Baron. I did not feel like a victor. There was a great lump in my throat. Had he been my dearest friend, I could have not felt greater sorrow. So we see this again and again, too, with these cases, that once the pilot sees his opponent as a human being and not as, quote, the enemy, faceless enemy, they suffered grievously, okay? So, I mean, the same is true now, I would argue. He also mentions, this is interesting, number 24 RAF General Hospital, not the general hospitals and relief stations that cropped up like mushrooms across the countryside. This was specifically for flyers. And he mentions near Hempstead Heath, do a lot of research here into the different kinds of troubles which are peculiar to flying people, purely for RAF officers, so they get lots of material. Very good idea having a hospital like this. As an organ hospital, did not understand or know how to treat troubles of flying people. So he's hinting at real problems with flyers that are specific to flying, sort of the aero-neurosis, aerosthenia, call it what you will, problems. So later years, yeah, he leaves the RAF in 1919. He's had enough excitement. He works as an accountant at a small grocery store in Canada, founded a small airline, still liked to fly, General Airways, and worked as editor of Canadian Aviation. Tried to join in World War II, was refused. In politics, lost election, bought a small farm, died of a heart attack. So kind of a not so glamorous end, but he another one that really suffered, and he did get through the war. Wasn't like Lambert, where he was put in the hospital for a long time. He was in and out of hospital, back on the line, back and forth throughout his whole flying career during the war. Okay. Ernst Udet, who doesn't know about Ernst? He grew up in Munich, a very large urban city. Early interest in aviation and model aircraft. He attended the Auto School of Flying, joined in 1915. Experienced a brief nervous breakdown very early and learned to fly the Fokker E-3s at Habsheim. So fascinating man, fascinating career. And perhaps of all of them, he probably fared the best. So Udets grew up in very urban, cosmopolitan environment. Militarism and Prussianism were on the rise at this time. Nationalism was on the rise. Munich and Germany in general was a center of education. Actually, it was among scholars in the academic community in the world at that time. You really would best serve you to learn German, because many of the amazing breakthroughs in academia were coming from Germany at that time. So if you were a scholar, you'd best know German to keep up with all of the wonderful things coming out of Germany. And it was an industrial power second only to the U.S. at this time. So a very different environment from Lambert or Brown or even Springs. Okay, and this actually helped, I think. He talks about chickening out in his first engagement. Basically, he's a very interesting way of writing. He talks about his opponent resembling some great ferocious insect bent upon my destruction. So he really is amping up the drama. Now it came for me to shoot in earnest, quite unable to do so, as though horror turned my blood to ice, taking the strength from my arms and numbed my brain. I sat passively in the cockpit, flying straight ahead, staring idiotically at the caudron as we passed each other. Suddenly the caudron machine gun opened fire. With sharp metallic sounds, a bullet struck my Fokker, which smashed my goggles. Splintered glass. My hand was covered in blood. You miserable coward, the engine seemed to say. My only thought was, thank God nobody saw it. So he's embarrassed, he's humiliated that he wasn't able to respond and shoot down the caudron. So he gets over it, though. He talks about this pivotal moment, heart beating furiously, clammy hands on the joystick, 1 against 23. My Fokker flew above the enemy squadron like a hawk. Even as I hesitated to realize that if I failed to open the battle immediately, I should never have the courage to do so afterwards. So it was his moment of truth. In that case, I have to land, go to my room, and then the morning Falzer would have to task of writing my father that there had been a fatal accident while I was cleaning my revolver. He either does this now or he goes home and blows his brains out, right? So that's the decision that he made for himself, and he does it, okay? Blooded. At the time, the thought that those men were human beings never once occurred to me. I was only conscious of one sensation: victory, triumph. The iron band about my chest snapped. The blood coursed freely through my veins. The tension was over, and I had been blooded. So he has his first kill, and he's so relieved that all of these thoughts and these anxieties are just over for him right now. But it's not that simple, right? He thinks that he's in the clear and he can be just a pure hunter, but it's not that simple. Human beings never are. He talks about this duel with Guillemet, French ace Georges Guillemet, and this notion of chivalry, which gets overdone with regards to World War I. All the pilots basically said this, but and a lot of popular culture, it gets overdone too. But he talks about this engagement where his guns jammed and Guillemet basically flew on his back over his head. He thought he was going to die. Great surprise, raised his arm and waved to me, peels off towards his lines, and that was it. I believe that Guillemet gave proof that even in modern warfare, there's still something left of the knightly chivalry of bygone days. So that was his take on it, anyway. So it's kind of heartening to hear that, especially from someone like Udet, who was a consummate ace for sure. So he's talking about this shooting down Lieutenant C.R. Masdorp of RFC 47. Flew back, my skin soaked in perspiration, my nerves in desperately excited state. I made a rule never to let myself worry about the men I shot down. But on this particular occasion, I felt an insatiable desire to know who my opponent had been. My opponent had been shot through the head. Also in the wallet were pictures of an elderly woman, and a letter. It said, "Don't be too reckless. Think of father and me." Somehow one had to try to get rid of the thought that a mother wept for every man one shot down. So he's deeply moved by this incident, and it just doesn't go away. Okay, in spite of his being blooded and his, very Teutonic sort of fixation on being the hunter and keeping his hunter instincts clean. Now, this comes back, his humanity comes back to haunt him. He talks about being home with his family. My friends were at the front. Many of them had been killed. I felt no particular desire to mix with strangers. So here again is this bond like Springs had with his comrades at the front. Such a unique and dynamic and emotionally charged context. How does home life even compare to that? You know, the home front in World War I was somewhat bizarre relative to the Western Front. The Western Front was this little bubble of horrific stuff, but you go home and everything was fine. I mean, aside from an occasional Zeppelin raid or bomber raid, but it was just kind of surreal and bizarre. We sat down to lunch. I thought, tell them only it was good for them. I said nothing about my last duel, the one with Masdorp. Didn't want to alarm my father, about which I felt some reluctance to speak. In any case, over Sauerbrunn and Clausen, I could not speak of a man whose death I had caused, a man whose bravery had won my respect. So even with Udet, it's the wheels are turning that what he did is something he's going to have to live with and reconcile. Okay. So he's talking about, oh boy, I got just a few minutes left. So he's talking about how his life has changed, his relationship with his girlfriend, very different from what a conventional relationship would be back home. His experience at the front has transformed him, made him live more boldly, more adventurously, sort of disregarding common conventions with regarding to courting. Okay. That being said, the close of the war, talking about we've been thrown out. The story goes that German people blame the German military for losing the war, stabbed in the back, so-called. If only we could fly again. The Versailles Treaty prevented that. Take a look at all this mess from above. It wouldn't be so bad. We sipped our drinks and stared straight ahead. He's talking about all the German pilots being grounded as per the Treaty of Versailles and having to just deal with it. So, the end of the war, he was an exhibition pilot in the States, served in the Third Reich, felt Goring, his squadron leader, betrayed him, killed himself, shot himself in the head. And he was the prototype for Ernst Kessler in The Great Waldo Pepper, which I'm sure many of you had seen. We are running out of time, so I'm just going to blow through McManus real quick. McManus was a fascinating character, basically born in, I'm trying to think of the town. Anyway, working class Irish Catholic, very sensitive man, enjoyed animals and books, two big red flags for a pilot of today. Hated the notion of the ace and had a passive-aggressive psychology. Yeah, Canterbury, that's where he grew up. Small Catholic area. Reading and drinking, it was quiet. It was a very small, rural, protected environment. Again, here we see it again. Felt like a murderer. Shooting down a two-seater. Apparently they carried a dog in the back and the dog was dead. I felt exactly like a murderer. Okay. Talking about his nerves being shot. My courage seems to be gone after that experience this morning. So this idea of using up emotional capital in combat and it's sort of wearing away at you cumulatively. Okay. He was an accomplished violin player and would often be seen in the mess hall playing his violin with such passion and feeling that one had to just stop what you were doing and listen. So again, a very sensitive man. Not a good thing for a combat pilot we find today. Just a description of him. Was obviously born leader. Always put other people before himself in terms of victories. He had many victories, but he would always help his squadron mates achieve victories to help the squadron as a whole. The beginning of collectivist or group tactics in the RAF, okay, or RFC. So Jim Miles was his best friend. Talks about McManus when he was home for leave in England. Started to tremble violently, grew in a convulsive straining. His face when he looked at was terrible sights, alive and tears running down his face. Couldn't stop. Soaked with sweat. Smiled weakly. He saw me watching, tried to make light of it. Would not talk about it at all, which was typical of the squadrons. Felt helpless not being able to do anything. Was ashamed to let him see him. His condition, but could not help it, however hard he tried. So Manic was scared to death of burning alive in a plane. That's basically just how he died. Okay, went down in flames, and He obsessed about it. He mentioned it every single flight. Made jokes about sizzle, sizzle, crackle, all of this stuff about being burned alive to the point where it's a little creepy. Yeah, shot down in flames on July 26. He had 60 victories. He was helping Donald Inglis of New Zealand get his first victory. Inglis says, "Poor Mick, the bloody bastard shot down my major in flames. His worst fear had become his end." Okay, last pilot. I know we're almost out of time. Georges Guillemet, unlikely. I call him the anti-ace because he was anything but what you would think of as an ace in terms of like very strong and athletic and robust. He was slight, weak, sickly. For him, it was a triumph of spirit over body. A very privileged upbringing in Compiègne, worked his way up. He did every nasty job in the squadron before he was allowed to fly, became a master SPAD pilot. And his mantra, unless one is given all, one is given nothing. Okay? So we don't need to really talk about that. We don't need to talk about that. We're talking about likening Guillemet to Roland in this sort of heraldic tradition of France. He's talking about his apprenticeship as a pilot. Painter grinds his colors, prelude his future flights, touch with his hands. He basically did everything you can imagine, from changing bearings to the oil to replacing cylinder rings. Every piece of machinery in an aircraft he had his hands on. Okay, and basically he wasn't that great of a flyer initially. Basically talking to his squadron leader, Brocard, saying, "You don't know me, but if you did, you know I would love to. I want to do it right." And Brocard said, "Okay, but you're wrecking a lot of planes. If you don't learn to fly in 2 weeks, you'd be washed out," because he'd wrecked like 6 planes or something like that. And this is talking about this, like Odette, this seminal moment where I master my nerves. He's talking to his little sister. "Mine are well tamed. I'm now the master of ball shotgun. 500 rounds of me have maneuvered necessary. Except that my life was decided that morning. Without facing up to it, I would have chickened out." Okay, he was talking about that turning point. Yeah, he was a hero. He had no private life anymore. Wherever he went, he was seen as a god, basically. This idea of the immortal ace kissed his uniform. Countless women followed him. All his decorations, the entire room stood up when he left. Just this crafting this image of the iconic ace. Then he had a stretch of bad luck and couldn't shake it, such that he basically forgot all of his training and flew into the not blind spot of a two-seater and was shot in the head. He's talking about the craft of being a combat pilot. He's talking about if the public knew what we knew, you wouldn't admire us as much. Kind of what I was saying earlier about scientific murder that Eddie Rinbeck had talked about. These basically that by the end of the war, these tactics had become so codified that it was very formulaic to shoot down another aircraft. So yeah, kills him on September 11th, 1917. Took all these risks that he normally wouldn't take him, but he's strung out, worn out, and failed to maneuver into the two-seater's blind spot, and a bullet hit him in the head, killing him. So that was that. So that's about the end of my presentation. I just have this one quote by Arthur Gould Lee, which is just wonderful. "And to those of us who are passed safely through this strife and bloodshed would be affected by it all the rest of our lives. And although maybe I'm not matched up in achievement with the best, I was there with them. It was my crowded hour of glorious life." So this very intense, almost narcotic experience of being at the front with this excitement and this passion and all of this intensity at this very compressed timeline, boy, something else. Eddie Rickenbacker, American pilot, also commented on how after the war, like, what's life going to be without the spice of danger that they felt day in, day out? I mean, it became almost like an addictive thing to experience this. All right. Again, the quote by Springs about the biggest part of myself being left at the front. I just love that quote. And then Arthur Gould Lee talking about something in me had gone out of me and was buried and would always be buried in 100 cemeteries in France and England, along with the companions of my youth who died that her country might live. So he's talking about the epic amount of casualties that it had to have some purpose. All right. I think we are done. So basically just a summary of some of the points of the talk. So with that, I will open it up to questions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mark. That was a really fascinating talk. I really enjoyed that.
Okay.
And I'm sure everyone else did as well. Before we get into the question and answer section, I just wanted to talk about the Royal Air Force Museum's
Yep.
current call to action. So while you're listening to me talk about that, if you've got any questions, have a think about them and use the ask a question button at the bottom of the screen. We've already got one loaded up and I've got a couple as well. But if you've got any questions, ask them in the ask a question section, and Mark will give you a wonderful answer, I'm sure. So if I just show everyone this is the Save the Arthur Scarfe Victoria Cross Medal call to action by the Royal Air Force Museum. So the museum is calling on the public support to help keep Squadron Leader Arthur Scarfe's Victoria Cross Medal in the UK. So Arthur Scarfe was the recipient of the only Victoria Cross awarded to the Royal Air Force for services in the Far East during the Second World War. This is an incredibly rare medal, and Arthur's story is a national treasure which represents an extraordinary and highly poignant story of great personal courage, and the RAF Museum is determined for it to remain within the UK. The museum is a registered charity and has just a few months to raise £660,000 to match the auction bid placed by an overseas buyer. If successful in the mission to acquire this one-of-a-kind medal, the VC will be preserved in the Royal Air Force Museum's National Collection on public display in London for future generations to see. So this is obviously, I think, a very worthy cause and of interest to the people watching this here. So if you want to help support the RF Museum's call to action, there's a call to action button by the side of the ask a question button. Very convenient. If you follow the link there, that'll take you to the page to give you more information. So yeah, we will open up to the question section now. So I'll start by asking the first question that came in from Derek Mark. He says, my wife's great uncle was the gunner of a BE FE2 that brought down Immelman. He never once spoke of it after the war. Was this common?
Yes, yes, it was. As with the Second World War, many combatants, be they airmen or people on the ground or even sailors, they felt that people at home just couldn't relate at all to what they experienced, and to tell them about this would just serve to confuse them, upset them. They just didn't understand. As I understand it, many did talk with comrades in arms, discussed what had happened. But again, it wasn't, Rivers' psychodynamic model of talking about it, coming to terms with it. That was just gaining traction during the war, and it's interesting. Everything they learned in the First World War seemed to be forgotten in the Second. Because many of the same problems cropped up again, and they kind of had to reinvent the wheel and revive all of these techniques and sort of protocols for people to heal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it is interesting because the question is kind of almost suggesting that, the lack of speaking about these traumatic events, was it common? And was there a reason why it would be common? So was it saving them from re-traumatizing themselves by reliving the stories? Was it sparing loved ones from what they thought would be traumatic to hear? Did they think it would tarnish their character, or perhaps give them undue praise? There's all elements of guilt, and I think
Yeah,
it's
guilt
an
for sure.
interesting question.
Yeah.
Richard Cook asks, was the World War One ace the propaganda antidote that governments needed for the horror of World War One, and were they not allowed to have any weaknesses as part of that fable?
Well, yeah, that's a whole thing. I mean, the RFC didn't think that promoting their aces, well, they started to at the end. Trenchard finally said, okay, the Germans and the French are doing it to good effect. The fear in England was that that would overly promote the flyers versus all the people that had died in the trenches, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to glamorize anybody, you should glamorize them all, not just the flyers. So they didn't want to give undue attention to the flyers when there's so many infantrymen that were dying in the trenches. I mean, on a daily basis, thousands of them. So that was kind of frowned upon in the RFC initially, but then they saw, as the war wore on, people craved some good news because it was always bad news, the stalemate of trench warfare, all of that. So that was somewhat of an antidote. Certainly, von Richthofen in Germany, he used his, you've seen those little rack cards of his portrait that he used. He would sign one, use it like cash. He talks about when his squadron ran out of food, he would sign a bunch of those and take it to wherever he could, hawk them for sausage and sauerkraut and potatoes so he could feed his squadron.
Yeah.
They were viewed as currency. So in French, of course, they mythologize Guillemet. Every schoolboy in every French school knew about Georges Guillemet. And like I said, I didn't really get into it, but likened him as Roland, the savior of France, and Charlemagne, all this stuff. It was just, wow, over the top. Plus, what's neat about Guillemet is that every person in France could see themselves as a Guillemet. If you came from humble beginnings, if you were sick and weakly, you could still be an ace. I mean, it was kind of a very powerful thing.
Yeah, I suppose in that sense, it's a way potentially of jumping class boundaries as well, perhaps, depending on the specific society and how that works. But yeah, I can certainly see that. Fiona Bambridge asks, would you include an addiction to gambling post-World War I in the 1920s as an indication of seeking risk, having served in the trenches later the RNS as a pilot? So, are there other things that were tells for having been a combat pilot, I suppose, is the question.
Well, look at Springs. I mean, he went completely off the rails, womanizing, gambling, drinking, partying, carousing. I mean, he just let it all hang out. And probably gambling as well. I mean, that's a very addictive habit for sure. I wouldn't be surprised if that same sort of adrenaline junkie kind of feeling that you got from the excitement of combat transmuted itself into other types of things, activities after the war, for sure. I mean, how can you can't really replace that, but you can try to, find things that are somewhat similar.
Yeah, I suppose if it's kind of the adrenaline rush, as it were, there's ways of almost tricking the body into having that kind of response. But the more you have that response, the more stimulation is required to elicit that response. So if you're trying to simulate aerial combat on the front lines of the First World War, there's not a whole lot that can get to that level of visual and audible stimulation, I suppose.
I mean, Udet went through, you can see if you Google, find YouTube clips of some of his demonstration flights, and they're fantastic. He does all kinds of amazing stunts with his custom built, I forget what the aircraft was, but so he wanted to demonstrate his consummate flying ability after the war to as many people as possible and get that adulation that you don't really get during the war. It's like, so that kind of, in Hollywood, of course, anyway, so.
I suppose I would ask, you talked about how the Red Baron, obviously you were talking about the idea of strafing runs and how some pilots were particularly repulsed by the idea of strafing infantry, whereas other pilots, and the example you gave was Red Baron, were almost elated by it. They enjoyed it like it was a game almost. Do you think there is a specific psychological makeup or profile which makes somebody more predisposed to feeling a certain way about that kind of action? I don't want to use the term psychopath because there is a tendency these days to diagnose people incorrectly with a very little data. But
that was on the tip of my tongue. Psychopath. Well, it's interesting because the way Udet describes Richthofen in his memoirs, he describes him as being the consummate Prussian. He was a killer, simple, plain and simple. I don't think it was simple for anybody.
Yeah.
As we know, with Richthofen in particular, after he was wounded in the head, he became much more caring about his squadron mates, much more cognizant of his own mortality. Anyway, but when Udet saw him pre that injury, I believe, he was, very in awe of the Baron's ability to just
Mm-hmm.
kill in a cold-hearted manner and
Mm-hmm.
not think twice about it.
Mm-hmm.
Come home and laugh and have a full meal, just not a problem. I think he was envious of it, actually.
Yeah, well, I suppose from the outside it would seem to be the simpler life, wouldn't it? If you're not so weighed down by the consequences of your actions and by the feelings, the nervous feelings you'd get getting back into the cockpit. And again, like I say, I think people react to these psychological stimuli in very different ways, and they also internalize them. So I think I mentioned it earlier when I said, are there some people who perhaps don't talk about traumatic events because of the fear of it re-traumatizing them? But you described something interesting, which was the opposite of that: people writing books and performing art as a way of coping. And so whether they're re-traumatizing themselves or not, there is perhaps a cathartic
Yeah,
element to that for
yeah,
some people, but not for everyone.
yeah. I mean, think about it. I mean, what you're involved in is the business of killing during the
Mm,
war and creating something after the war in the way of writing, or whether it's a picture or photographs
mm,
or whatever it is, creative endeavor is a tonic to that. And you're
mm,
building something. You're not destroying something. You're
mm,
building something. And that's, I mean, as a writer, I find it very satisfying to write and
mm,
to research and all of that, as we all do. But um, you know, having that added baggage of trauma during the war, I mean, would be especially important, I would think, to, they, as I said, they
mm,
wrote copious letters. A lot of them kept journals, and that helped
mm,
get some of that out, even if they didn't publish the journals or even if they burned them after the war.
mm.
Just writing it down and working it through on paper, I think, is a cathartic uh, tonic to what ailed them for
Yeah,
sure.
I agree. Somebody going by the username of just T, so I'll let you guess what the name is. I don't know. They ask, did the authorities, did the authorities tolerate and maybe even encourage drinking as a way to deal with things? So were there kind of recreational,
Well,
encourage recreational ways of coping,
Well,
perhaps?
I mean, I guess it depends on who the authorities are. If it's the
Uh-huh.
squadron leaders, sure, they totally do what you got to do. Just be wide awake and bushy tailed in the morning for
Yep.
patrol. You want to go carouse. I mean, stories of like Charles Nungesser showing up after partying all night with his girlfriend and still in a tux, and the bottle of champagne in his hand, throws that down, gets in his Newport, and flies off. So there's many instances of stuff like that.
Yeah.
I mean, the idea, that we don't know if we're going to die tomorrow, so we're going to live it
Mhm,
up tonight. That was certainly, preponderant
mhm.
with many of the airmen in the squadrons for sure.
Yeah, I mean, if we see it in the idea in the trenches in the First World War of British soldiers being given rationed alcohol, and the question is, to what extent is that a way of increasing and keeping the morale of soldiers? Here we're talking about, do the effects of alcohol, are they do the authorities recognize that they limit the kind of the overthinking and the stewing that comes with
Yeah,
being
yeah,
kind of psychologically damaged
yeah.
during
I
a
mean, I
conflict.
can't find I can't find a written mandate or set of orders from, say, Trenchard that said you will all drink per se,
Yeah.
but it certainly was tolerated and certainly I mean, any problems kind of looked the other way because, like Parsons said, it was kind of a structural component to getting through these patrols,
Mhm,
is taking that edge off.
mhm,
I mean, you see that at popular culture, but in the movie Malcolm McDowell, Aces High,
mhm.
he's a squadron leader. Many of you have probably seen that. He first thing he does when he gets out of his plane is takes a couple snorts, and it's just and he admits, I can't get in one of those things without getting tying one on. So
Yeah.
it happened a lot. I mean, the high altitude, the cold. I mean, it was brutally cold. These were open
Yeah.
cockpits. I mean, my goodness, by today's standards, barbaric, really. So, and then oxygen want, all of that, hypoxia. Yeah.
You talk about you talk about this idea of squadron leaders and officers being very much of the mind that as long as you're in the aircraft and you're alert and you're ready to go when we need you, then that is not sufficient, but that is important. How many pilots, let's say, on the Western Front during the First World War were? How many of them would actively would they get to a point where they'd actively refuse to fly another sortie? Was there a breaking moment where individuals could not get in the aircraft again? Did you have examples of that?
Well, so like with Lambert, when his switch went off, he was obviously incapacitated. He was obviously acting kooky. Didn't recognize anybody. Didn't respond to commands. Sat there in a stupor. So he was clearly fried. And they recognized that and put them in hospital. That was what they did because they didn't know what else to do with them.
Yeah.
Many of them ended up in the wrong hospital or in the wrong hands. I mean, there's countless of people that were put in just general hospitals that were walking wounded. They were suffering from, aero-neurosis, for lack of a better term, aerial shell shock, and there's nothing physically wrong with them, but their mind, their psyche was just gone. So, that a lot of that, and plus after the war, the amount of treatment after the war that became a huge debacle in every country in terms of now we have the VA Veterans Administration, we have hospitals in care to deal with PTSD after the event, but at this time England was looking at the amount of people that were diagnosed with this and struggling with how we're going to pay for it. Like the amount of people in hospital that are still suffering from shell shock and from various other war-related traumas. We don't know how we're going to pay for this. And so a lot of them were, there was an effort to discharge early, and we can't care for all these people indefinitely.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Okay.
Fiona, this is probably the last question of today. Fiona Bambridge asks, have you identified that British culture in World War One, before and after World War One, discouraged expressions of trauma, depression by pilots or soldiers more than other countries? So the States, France, Germany. So is there more of a cultural repression of those expressions of psychological stress in Britain than elsewhere?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, I think, Udet was I think he was pretty open about how he felt about stuff, although he talks about, suffering privately. It really, I mean, we only know what we know. So what's been written, definitely like Manick and various other British flyers do describe that was talking about problems in combat was discouraged. I mean, that was from top down. It was discouraged because they saw it as eroding morale and making the whole unit kind of, not on their A game at all. So I think I can see that. I can definitely appreciate that. But again, the treatment systems weren't perfected by that time, and as far as I know, they still aren't. Just to get off topic for a second, I talked to some U.S. Air Force doctors at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base as part of this book. We all got in a room and had a roundtable about this notion of aero-neurosis or aerial PTSD, and he sent me his lecture, his presentation he was going to give at an annual conference in New York City. And you know what? The upshot was the same problems that they were wrestling with in World War I, they're still wrestling with today. They can change the hardware, they can change the machinery, they can change the training, but you can't get away from the fact that you're a human being and you have a conscience.
Yeah, so, I mean, they've found that with increasingly with people operating drones, that they're suffering from many of the same psychological conditions that pilots were, and conventional wisdom wouldn't have suggested as much because of how detached they are from the physicality of combat. And yet, despite all of that distance and all of that technology in between them and the battlefield, it's still there. So I think that's interesting. It's interesting that you raised that.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, that being said, uh, you know, a strong Air Force is a necessary component of the modern world for sure.
Indeed.
You know, so.
I think I think that's a good point to end on. Actually, I think that's perfect.
Yeah.
Richard Cook pointed out in the comments that your what you said about building, not destroying, as a cathartic exercise, I think, is a good point to end on as well. So I just wanted to say thank you, Mark, for joining us today.
My
I'm
pleasure.
sure everyone else, and they've commented to say as much, enjoyed the talk thoroughly and as much as I did. Just wanted to remind everyone again, save the Arthur Scarth Victoria Cross Medal. If you could help the museum out, that would be fantastic. It's for a really good cause, and it's to keep history protected and to keep it in a place where it can be seen. So thank you, everyone, and thank you, Mark. I'll end the broadcast now. You can catch these crowdcasts again on the Crowdcast platform. They're all uploaded immediately after the talk, so you can see us talking again, and you can watch Mark's talk again if you need. Thank you very much, and cheers, Mark. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.